October 14, 1966, 11:42 p.m. The VIP backroom of the Renaissance Ballroom, 2348 7th Avenue. The air tasted like stale cigar smoke and impending violence. 5 men sat around a mahogany table, laughter barking from their throats like jagged glass. In the center of the room stood Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. He was 60 years old. He was alone. And, most terrifyingly, his hands were empty. No switchblade in his boot. No snub-nosed .38 in his waistband. Just a neatly pressed gray suit and a silence that weighed more than a ton of lead. Across the table, Trigger, Mike Coppola's nephew, skinny Vinny DeLuca, wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. He leveled a silver-plated Colt 911 at Bumpy's chest. The distance was 6 feet, a heartbeat away from death. The stakes were the entirety of the numbers racket from 1/10th to 155th Street, roughly $40,000 a week in pure cash. But the laughter died the second Bumpy checked his watch. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at the time. "You boys have exactly 8 minutes, Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. Use them wisely." 2 weeks earlier, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. By 1966, he was the Grand Chessmaster of Harlem. Having returned from a decade-long stretch in Alcatraz 3 years prior, the landscape had shifted under his feet. The Italians were getting greedy, the young bloods were getting reckless, and the police were getting expensive. But Bumpy remained the constant variable. He walked with a limp, carried a cane, and possessed an intellect that could dissect a rival's strategy before they even poured their morning coffee. He didn't rule by brute force alone. He ruled because he understood the infrastructure of power better than the politicians downtown. He was the man who played the white mob against the black street gangs and collected the difference. Harlem in the autumn of '66 was a powder keg sitting next to a lit match. The civil rights movement was fracturing into black power militancy, riots were becoming a summer tradition, and the heroin trade was flooding the streets with a toxic white tide. The Genovese crime family, longtime partners of the Harlem underworld, saw the chaos as an opportunity for a hostile takeover. They believed the old line was toothless. They thought the years in the rock had broken his spirit. They mistook his silence for senility. The tension had snapped on September 30th. 2 of Bumpy's runners were found in an alley behind the Apollo Theater, beaten within an inch of their lives. The message pinned to their shirts was clear: the surcharge goes up to 40% or the streets turn red. It was a direct challenge to Bumpy's sovereignty. The Genovese family wasn't asking for a bigger slice of the pie. They were coming for the whole bakery. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting for the gunfire to start. The pawn shops on 125th Street boarded up their windows. Everyone knew war was coming. But Bumpy didn't declare war. He sent an invitation. The man laughing at the end of the gun barrel was Vincent "the Vulture" DeLuca. A rising caporegime in the Genovese family, DeLuca was a man who enjoyed his work too much. He earned his nickname not by swooping in on the dead, but by picking the bones of the living clean. In 1964, he had famously taken over a union local in Hell's Kitchen by throwing the previous steward off a 6-story roof, then billing the widow for the cleaning costs of the sidewalk. He was 32, arrogant, and believed that fear was the only currency that mattered. DeLuca wanted Harlem. Specifically, he wanted the policy bank's the numbers game. It was a cash cow that produced millions annually, tax-free. He viewed the black gangsters of Harlem as unsophisticated placeholders, seat warmers waiting for the real mob to arrive. He despised Bumpy Johnson, viewing the older man's philosophical approach to crime as weakness. DeLuca had convinced his bosses downtown that a swift decapitation strike would hand them the territory overnight. He was dangerous because he lacked the one thing that kept the peace in the underworld: respect for the rules. DeLuca didn't care about neutral ground or parlays. He had 12 confirmed hits to his name, and he bragged about each one. He traveled with a crew of 4 heavyweights, men with necks thicker than their heads and consciences lighter than air. They carried shotguns and violin cases and wore cruelty like a cheap cologne. On this night, DeLuca wasn't just planning to kill Bumpy Johnson. He planned to humiliate him. He had issued the summons to the Renaissance Ballroom, demanding Bumpy come alone to negotiate terms of surrender. It was a trap, plain and simple, and he was delighted that the old fool had walked right into it. DeLuca's plan was crude but effective. Lure the king out of his castle, isolate him, mock him, kill him. Leave the body on the steps of the 28th Precinct as a warning to anyone else who thought they ran Harlem. The Renaissance Ballroom was technically neutral ground, a place for dances and socialite weddings, but DeLuca had bought off the night watchman for $500. The building was empty, echoing, and theirs. The back room was stifling. The velvet curtains were drawn tight against the street lights of 7th Avenue. A single bulb hung over the table, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced on the walls. The smell was a mixture of DeLuca's heavy cologne, the metallic tang of gun oil, and the sour sweat of anticipation. 5 men sat. 1 man stood. "You see this, boys?" DeLuca sneered, the silver Colt steady in his hand. "The king of Harlem looks more like the janitor to me." The 4 goons erupted in sycophantic laughter. One of them, a brute named Sal, with a scar running to his eyebrow, toyed with the switchblade, clicking it open and shut. Click-clack. Click-clack. The sound was a metronome counting down the seconds of Bumpy's life. 11:45 p.m. "I assume my decline of your 40% offer was received?" Bumpy asked. His voice was calm, almost bored. He adjusted his cufflinks. "We got it," DeLuca grinned, showing gold-capped teeth. "And we rejected it. Now, get on your knees, old man. I want to see you beg before I put a window in your forehead." 11:46 p.m. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't blink. He stared at DeLuca with eyes that had seen the inside of solitary confinement in Alcatraz. Eyes that had stared down Dutch Schultz. "Kneeling is for prayer, Vincent. I didn't come here to pray. I came to give you a chance to leave." The laughter stopped. The air in the room grew heavy, pressurized. Sal stopped clicking his knife. 11:48 p.m. "You got a lot of lip for a dead man," DeLuca hissed, standing up. He shoved the gun forward, the muzzle inches from Bumpy's nose. "Last chance. Knees, now." Bumpy sighed. It was the sigh of a disappointed father. He looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12. "Time's up," Bumpy whispered. 11:49 p.m. The room went silent. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of the grave. Then a sound. Not a gunshot. A rumble. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the floorboards, from the walls, from the very bones of the building. DeLuca frowned, his eyes darting to the door. What the hell is? Crash. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom didn't open. They splintered inward. But it wasn't police. It wasn't federal agents. It was dogs. German shepherds. Dobermans. Great Danes. A snarling, frothing tide of muscle and teeth poured into the room, but they didn't attack. They stopped. 20 of them. They formed a semicircle behind Bumpy, a growling phalanx of fur and fury. The sound of 20 apex predators growling in unison vibrated in the chests of the Italian hitmen. DeLuca's hand shook. The gun wavered. Then, from the darkness of the hallway, a lighter clicked. A flame illuminated a face, then another, then 10 more. Men stepped into the light, not gangsters in suits, not soldiers. These were regular Harlem citizens. Dock workers with iron hooks, butchers with cleavers still stained from the day's work, Vietnam vets in fatigue jackets holding baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire. 50 men squeezed into the room, lining the walls, blocking the exits. They didn't say a word. They just stared. What Vincent DeLuca didn't know, what his arrogance wouldn't let him see, was that Bumpy Johnson didn't just own the rackets, he owned the people. 3 days prior, Bumpy had visited the back rooms of the local barber shops, the union halls, and the vet clinics. He hadn't asked for hitmen. He hadn't asked for the community. He knew DeLuca checked for wires. He knew DeLuca checked for guns. But DeLuca didn't check the basement of the Renaissance Ballroom, where the local dog trainer, a man Bumpy had helped with a loan 5 years ago, kept his kennel. He didn't check the service elevators where the maintenance crew, whose children Bumpy had sent to college, were waiting. Bumpy had walked in unarmed because he was the weapon. The city was his armor. Bumpy took a step forward. The dogs growled louder, a cacophony of impending violence. The mobsters were frozen. If DeLuca pulled the trigger, he would die. His men would die. They would be torn apart by teeth and beaten to pulp by iron. "You wanted to see the king?" Bumpy said. his voice hard as granite. He reached into his jacket pocket. DeLuca flinched, nearly firing. Bumpy pulled out a single white handkerchief. He slowly wiped his forehead. "You mistake a gun for power, Vincent. A gun runs out of bullets. Loyalty? Loyalty never runs dry." Bumpy pointed to the floor. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He just pointed. "Knees," Bumpy said. DeLuca looked at the dogs. He looked at the 50 men with hate in their eyes and weapons in their hands. He looked at Bumpy. The realization washed over him. He was a tourist in a jungle he didn't understand. Slowly, painfully, Vincent the Vulture DeLuca lowered the silver Colt. He placed it on the table. His knees hit the floor with a hollow thud. One by one, his 4 heavyweights followed. Sal dropped the switchblade. The tough guys from Hell's Kitchen, the men who laughed at death, were trembling. They were crawling. 11:55 p.m. The scene was surreal. 5 high-ranking members of the Genovese crime family were on their hands and knees on the dusty floor of a Harlem ballroom, surrounded by silent men and growling dogs. Bumpy walked over to DeLuca. He picked up the silver Colt. He weighed it in his hand, then popped the magazine out and pocketed the bullets. He tossed the empty gun back onto the table. It clattered loudly in the silence. "You tell Chinjaganti," Bumpy said, leaning down so his whisper screamed in DeLuca's ear, "that Harlem is closed for business. If I see you above 110th Street again, I won't bring the dogs next time. I'll just leave you to the people." Bumpy turned and walked out. The wall of men parted like the Red Sea to let him pass. As he left the room, he snapped his fingers. The dogs fell silent. The men lowered their weapons. DeLuca and his crew didn't move for 10 minutes after Bumpy left. They were too terrified to stand up. When they finally scrambled out the back exit, they left their dignity and their reputation on that ballroom floor. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. From the Lenox Lounge to Small's Paradise, everyone knew the Italians hadn't been shot. They had been broken. The Genovese family quietly replaced DeLuca a week later. He was sent to run a low-rent bookmaking operation in Jersey City. The 40% demand was never mentioned again. This confrontation, often whispered about but rarely documented in police files, epitomized the legend of Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't about the violence he could inflict. It was about the violence he could command without lifting a finger. He understood that in the chess game of the underworld, the king piece doesn't need to move much if the pawns control the board. Bumpy died of a heart attack 2 years later in 1968 at Wells Restaurant. But that night at the Renaissance Ballroom proved why he was the Godfather of Harlem. Other gangsters used fear to take. Bumpy used respect to hold. He showed that true power isn't holding the gun. It's controlling the room so completely that the gun becomes useless. Real power, Bumpy once told a young Frank Lucas, is when you don't have to raise your voice for people to hear you. If this story showed you why Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem, hit subscribe. Drop a like if you respect the code. Comment below, would you have had the guts to walk into that room unarmed? Next week, we're diving deep into the vaults, the true story of when Lucky Luciano tried to take Harlem and why he failed.